Still, when the crowd outside the overturned car had already backed away in fear of the smoke curling from the engine, a boy in a torn jacket pushed through the circle of onlookers, shouting at a man reaching toward the wreckage, "Don't touch him, I can save her." Nobody in that crowd understood, in the first confused seconds, why a street kid with dirt on his knees seemed to know something about the crash that none of the panicked adults standing around it did. The boy's name was Ronan, he was 12 years old, and he had spent the last year and a half living on the streets of the industrial district ever since a fire had destroyed the apartment building where he lived with his father, a fire that had taken his father's life and left Ronan with no other close family willing or able to take him in, to fend largely for himself, while a slow, overwhelmed foster system tried to catch up to his case. Before we go any further, if you believe that knowledge born from hardship can still show up exactly when the world needs it most, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that the people we walk past without noticing sometimes carry exactly the skill required to save someone else's life. Now back to the story. The crash that afternoon had happened directly outside the auto repair garage where Ronan had spent most of his days over the past year, not as an employee but as a quiet, tolerated presence the shop's owner, a gruff but soft-hearted mechanic named Walter, had allowed to hang around in exchange for small chores, sweeping floors, organizing parts bins, fetching tools. Walter had noticed, within the first few weeks of Ronan's presence, an unusual and persistent curiosity in the boy, not about cars exactly, but about anything mechanical, anything that could be understood by taking it apart and figuring out how its pieces worked together. It had been Walter, in fact, who had first taught Ronan the basics of vehicle extraction, an unusual skill for a mechanic to know in depth, but one Walter had picked up years earlier during a brief stint volunteering with a rural fire department before an injury ended that chapter of his life. Walter still kept a set of extraction tools in the garage, a habit from those years, and one slow afternoon, noticing Ronan's fascination with how car frames were constructed, had shown him, almost as an afterthought, how a trapped person could be safely extracted from a wrecked vehicle without causing further injury, which points of a frame were structurally load-bearing and which could be safely cut, how to stabilize a person's neck and spine before any movement occurred, the delicate, patient sequence of actions that separated a safe extraction from one that risked paralyzing or killing the very person you were trying to save. Ronan had absorbed this information the way he absorbed everything mechanical, completely, hungrily, practicing the sequence in his head during the long, uncertain nights he spent since his father's death, turning the knowledge over and over the way some people turn over a worry, needing to master it entirely, needing, in some quiet, wounded part of himself, to believe that he would never again be the person standing helplessly outside a burning building, unable to do anything as someone he loved was lost inside it. The car that crashed that afternoon belonged to a woman named Priscilla Hartwell Vance, 44 years old, an attorney driving home from a client meeting when a delivery truck ran a red light and struck her vehicle broadside, sending it into a slow, violent rollover that left it resting on its roof against the curb outside Walter's garage. Priscilla was conscious but trapped, her seatbelt holding her upside down, smoke beginning to curl from beneath the crumpled hood, her leg pinned awkwardly against the dashboard in a position that made any hurried attempt to pull her free almost certain to cause further injury, possibly severing her spinal cord if handled incorrectly. A crowd had gathered within moments, the way crowds always do, and among them was a well-meaning but untrained bystander, a delivery driver named Marcus, who, seeing the smoke and hearing Priscilla's frightened cries from inside the wreckage, had begun moving toward the car with the instinctive but dangerous urgency of someone who understood only that time was short and did not understand the specific mechanics of why hurried movement could make everything catastrophically worse. It was at that exact moment, as Marcus reached for the crumpled door frame, that Ronan pushed through the crowd, shouting the words that would stop him in his tracks. Before we continue, we want to pause here because what Ronan said next carried a specificity that no untrained bystander could have offered by accident. He told Marcus, urgently but clearly, that pulling on the door frame at that angle could shift the vehicle's weight and crush Priscilla's pinned leg further, possibly causing the kind of injury that could not be undone. He told him that the smoke, while frightening, was not yet indicating imminent fire, that the priority was stabilizing her neck before any extraction was attempted, and that moving her incorrectly in her current position risked far greater harm than the smoke itself. Marcus, stunned by both the accuracy of what a 12-year-old had just told him and the calm, steady urgency in his voice, stepped back. "How do you know all that?" he asked, his voice shaking with adrenaline. "I learned it," Ronan said simply. Please, just listen to me. I need someone strong to help hold the frame steady once I get to her, and someone needs to call for the fire department's extraction unit, not just an ambulance. Tell them the vehicle needs proper stabilization equipment." What followed over the next several minutes was something the small crowd outside Walter's garage would talk about for years afterward. Ronan approached the overturned vehicle with a calm, methodical focus that belied his age, first checking, through the shattered window, that Priscilla was conscious and breathing, speaking to her in a steady, reassuring voice, telling her his name, telling her help was coming, asking her gently not to try to move on her own no matter how badly she wanted to. He directed Marcus and another bystander, a construction worker named Felix, who had stopped his truck upon seeing the crash, to help stabilize the vehicle's frame using a jack Ronan retrieved from Walter's garage, positioning it exactly the way Walter had once shown him, at a precise angle that would prevent further shifting without risking a collapse that could crush the cabin further. He talked Priscilla through, breathing slowly to conserve oxygen given the smoke, and when Walter himself came running out of the garage upon hearing the commotion, stunned to see his young apprentice directing an active rescue with a competence that startled even him, Ronan simply looked at him and said, "I remembered everything you taught me. I need your help getting the door frame cut without shifting her weight." Walter, recovering quickly from his shock, grabbed the proper cutting tool from his shop and worked alongside Ronan, the two of them moving with a coordinated precision that impressed the arriving fire department extraction team so thoroughly that the lead firefighter later admitted in an interview given weeks afterward that by the time his crew arrived, the most dangerous part of the extraction, the initial stabilization that prevents further injury during the crucial early minutes, had already been handled correctly, buying Priscilla precious additional safety before professional equipment even reached the scene. Priscilla was extracted successfully, her leg injury serious but survivable, without the spinal complications that improper handling could have caused. She was transported to the hospital, stable, conscious, and, according to her later statements to local news outlets, absolutely certain that the calm voice of a 12-year-old boy talking her through those terrifying minutes was the reason she had not panicked into the kind of desperate self-extraction attempt that could have left her permanently paralyzed. Before we go further, we want to acknowledge the person who made this moment possible, because a 12-year-old boy does not develop this kind of specific technical competence in isolation. Walter, the gruff mechanic who had tolerated a homeless boy's presence in his garage out of simple, unspoken kindness, had, almost as an afterthought one slow afternoon, taught him a skill from his own past life that neither of them imagined would ever be needed in such dramatic circumstances. He had never formally decided to prepare Ronan for anything. He had simply shared knowledge with a curious boy, because sharing knowledge was, to Walter, simply what you did when someone wanted to learn something you happened to know. Priscilla, once recovered enough to process what had happened, insisted on meeting the boy who had guided her through the wreckage. Walter, who by then had become something of an informal guardian to Ronan, arranged the meeting carefully, mindful of Ronan's fragile situation within the foster system and wary of any attention that might complicate rather than help his circumstances. The meeting, when it happened, was quiet and deeply emotional. Priscilla, still in a hospital bed, her leg elevated and heavily bandaged, held Ronan's hand and thanked him, telling him that she had 2 children of her own, twin daughters around his age, and that she could not fully process the specific horror of what almost happening to their mother that afternoon, an outcome averted entirely because a stranger's child happened to know exactly what to do at exactly the right moment. She asked him gently about his life, and Ronan, cautious after 18 months of learning not to expect too much from adults who express sudden interest, told her a version of the truth, enough to explain his circumstances without revealing more than he was ready to share with someone he had just met. Priscilla, listening, made a decision in that hospital bed that she would later describe as one of the clearest, most certain decisions of her entire life. What followed over the next several months was, again, not framed by Priscilla as charity, and Ronan, wary of exactly that framing, would not have accepted it if it had been. Priscilla, a practicing attorney with connections throughout the local legal and social services community, used her professional network to expedite Ronan's stalled foster case, working directly with caseworkers to identify a stable, appropriate placement, rather than leaving him in the overwhelmed general system that had, for 18 months, left him effectively fending for himself. She personally vetted several potential foster families before ultimately, after months of careful consideration and to her own quiet surprise, deciding to pursue fostering him herself, having come to understand through their growing relationship during her recovery that she wanted Ronan to be part of her own family rather than simply directing him towards someone else's. Walter, though he had never formally sought guardianship himself given his own circumstances as a single aging mechanic with a demanding small business, remained a consistent, central figure in Ronan's life throughout this transition, insisting on being present for every major decision, and Priscilla, understanding the depth of the bond between Ronan and the man who had unknowingly prepared him to save her life, made sure Walter remained as involved as any family member would be, inviting him to holidays, to school events, to every milestone that followed. Ronan's transition into Priscilla's household, alongside her twin daughters, Josephine and Adelaide, was not without its own adjustments, the way any significant life change involves difficulty, even when it is, on the whole, deeply positive. He struggled in the early months with the particular discomfort of accepting stability after 18 months of learning to survive without it, sometimes hoarding food out of old habit, sometimes flinching at loud noises in ways that took the family time to understand and gently accommodate. Priscilla, drawing on her own recovery from trauma following the crash, approached these adjustments with patience rather than frustration, understanding intuitively that healing rarely follows a straight line. The twins, initially uncertain how to relate to a brother who had arrived under such extraordinary circumstances, grew close to Ronan gradually, drawn in particular to his quiet, careful way of explaining how things worked, a habit he had carried over from his time at Walter's garage. Josephine, in particular, developed a fascination with mechanics that mirrored Ronan's own, and the two of them began spending weekends at Walter's garage together, Walter delighted to have not one but two curious young minds to teach. 2 years after the crash, Ronan, now 14, had begun a formal youth training program in emergency vehicle extraction and basic first response, sponsored partly by the fire department, whose lead firefighter had never forgotten the competence he witnessed at that crash scene. He balanced this training with regular schoolwork and continued visits to Walter's garage, refusing, even as his life grew more stable, to abandon the relationship with the man whose casual afternoon lesson had once given him the tools to save a stranger's life. Priscilla, in the years that followed, often reflected that the crash which had nearly cost her life had also, through circumstances she could never have predicted, given her a son she had not known she was missing. She kept, framed in her home office, a photograph from the day Ronan officially joined the family, standing between her and Walter, all three of them smiling in a way that captured, better than words ever could, the strange, unlikely distance a single afternoon of quiet mechanical instruction had traveled toward becoming a genuine, lasting family. The night before Ronan's certification ceremony for his youth emergency response training, he sat with Walter at the garage, the same corner where he had once slept on cold nights before Walter quietly began leaving the back door unlocked for him without ever making it a formal arrangement. He told Walter that he had decided definitively to pursue emergency response as his actual career, and that he wanted Walter to know that everything he had built toward that goal had started with one ordinary afternoon of a mechanic patiently answering a curious kid's questions about how cars were built and how people could be safely pulled from them. Walter, not a man given to visible emotion, simply nodded and told him that teaching him had never felt, at the time, like anything more than an ordinary Tuesday, and that he considered it one of the great unexpected privileges of his life to have been the person standing nearby when that ordinary knowledge turned out to matter more than either of them could have imagined. In the weeks following the crash, Walter found himself fielding questions from neighbors and regular customers who had heard, through the fast-moving grapevine of a tight-knit industrial district, about what had happened outside his garage that afternoon. He answered them all the same way, deflecting credit toward Ronan rather than himself, though those who knew him well understood that his quiet pride in the boy ran deeper than his modest answers led on. Walter had spent 11 years running his small shop, largely alone since his wife's passing, and those closest to him noted that something in him had visibly lightened since Ronan had started spending his days there, a companionship neither of them had ever formally named, but both had clearly come to depend on. The fire department's lead extraction officer, a veteran named Captain Reyes, requested a formal meeting with Ronan in the weeks following the incident, initially out of simple professional curiosity about how a civilian bystander had managed such precise, technically sound stabilization under pressure. What began as a brief debrief turned into a much longer conversation once Captain Reyes realized the depth of Ronan's understanding, and by the end of their meeting, he had already begun making calls to a regional youth emergency services program he knew of, believing Ronan's raw aptitude deserved a formal pathway, rather than being left to develop entirely through improvised circumstance. Priscilla's recovery from her own injuries ran parallel to the deepening of her relationship with Ronan, and she often noted in later conversations with friends that watching him visit her hospital room during her recovery, quietly checking on her well-being with the same careful attentiveness he had shown at the crash site, had been part of what convinced her that her interest in his life went beyond simple gratitude. She recalled, in particular, one afternoon when her daughters visited alongside their nanny, and Ronan, meeting Josephine and Adelaide for the first time, spent nearly an hour patiently answering their rapid-fire questions about the crash with a gentleness that suggested he understood intuitively that they needed reassurance as much as information. The foster case expediting process that Priscilla pursued on Ronan's behalf was not without its bureaucratic difficulties, even with her professional connections. Caseworkers, accustomed to overwhelmed systems and lengthy wait lists, required extensive documentation and multiple home visits before finalizing any placement, and Priscilla, despite her frustration with the pace, never allowed that frustration to reach Ronan, understanding that a boy who had already endured so much upheaval needed calm reassurance from the adults around him rather than visible anxiety about the process's uncertainty. During this transitional period, Walter's role became especially important, providing Ronan with a consistent daily anchor while the more permanent aspects of his living situation remained unresolved. Walter began, without any formal arrangement, ensuring Ronan had a proper dinner each evening, sometimes cooking simple meals in the small break room at the back of his shop, other times walking him to a nearby diner, where the owner, aware of Ronan's circumstances through neighborhood word of mouth, quietly ensured his meals were never fully charged to Walter's tab. Josephine's growing fascination with mechanics, which had begun during her weekend visits to Walter's garage alongside Ronan, eventually led her to enroll in a youth engineering program at her school, something she credited directly to watching her new brother's careful, patient explanations of how engines worked. Walter, delighted to have a second eager student, began teaching her the same foundational skills he had once shown Ronan, though he was careful to note with a small smile that he had no intention of teaching either of them the vehicle extraction techniques until they were considerably older. There was a quieter detail from that afternoon at the crash site that few people, beyond Walter and Captain Reyes, ever fully learned. In the moments right after Ronan shouted his warning to Marcus, before anyone had time to question a 12-year-old's authority in that chaotic scene, Walter, running from the garage toward the commotion, had for a split second considered pulling Ronan back himself, worried about the danger of a child so close to a smoking wreck. It was the specific, unshakable calm in Ronan's voice, a calm Walter recognized instantly from the many quiet afternoons they had spent together discussing engines and frames, that made him trust his own instruction rather than his fear, a decision he later said was one of the hardest and most important he ever made in the span of a single second. Priscilla's twin daughters, initially cautious about their mother's sudden decision to foster a boy they had met only briefly under such dramatic circumstances, grew close to Ronan through small, ordinary moments rather than any single dramatic gesture, homework help, shared meals, the particular unglamorous intimacy of simply living under the same roof day after day. Adelaide, the quieter of the twins, formed a bond with Ronan first, drawn to his own tendency toward careful observation rather than loud declaration, and it was often Adelaide who noticed, before anyone else in the household, the small signs that Ronan was struggling on a particular day, a habit Priscilla later said reminded her powerfully of the exact instinct that had once made Ronan notice, at a crash site, precisely what needed to happen before anyone else could see it. On the second anniversary of the crash, Captain Reyes invited Ronan, by then well into his formal youth emergency response training, to speak briefly to a group of new firefighter recruits about the incident, wanting them to understand early in their careers that composure and correct technical knowledge could matter more in a crisis than years of formal service alone. Standing in front of a room of trainees nearly twice his age, Ronan told the story simply, without embellishment, ending it the way he often did in later years, by saying that he did not consider what he had done especially remarkable, only the direct result of someone once taking the time to teach him properly, and that he hoped, throughout his own future career, to extend that same patient teaching to others. Never underestimate what a person can learn from an ordinary act of kindness. Never assume that knowledge shared casually cannot end up mattering in the most extraordinary circumstances. Never dismiss a stranger's competence because of what their circumstances look like from the outside. And never forget that sometimes the person capable of saving a life has been quietly preparing for that exact moment, without either of you ever realizing it, since the day someone simply chose to teach them something worth knowing. If this story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment about the part that stayed with you longest, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that ordinary kindness sometimes prepares people for extraordinary moments. Subscribe for more stories about courage, resilience, and the unexpected ways knowledge and compassion find their way exactly where they are needed most. Because sometimes the calmest, most capable voice at the scene of a crisis belongs to the person everyone almost overlooked on the sidewalk outside.